Is it true?
Is what true?
Is your mother a nigger?
Imitation of Life belongs in the tragic mulatto genre.
You found out I'm not white. Because you keep telling the world I'm your daughter. Anything you can spoil, you spoil.
A tragic mulatto is a mixed-race person, usually female, who is light-skinned enough to pass for white. The tragedy comes from their inability to fit into either world. While this does sound very white man's burden-y to modern eyes, this character type was usually viewed sympathetically.
I don't want to have to come through back doors or feel lower than other people or apologize for my mother's color.
Don't say that!
She can't help her color.
Imitation of Life does this in a way, but it benefits from being written and set in the 20th century, well after the end of slavery. Douglas Sirk's 1959 film is actually a remake of a 1934 film by John Stahl, which itself is an adaptation of Fanny Hurst's novel. The story is of two single mothers, Beatrice and Delilah. Beatrice is a widow trying to keep her husband's business of selling syrup door-to-door afloat, while Delilah is looking for a job that'll allow her to take care of her daughter. She becomes Bee's housekeeper, and the two of them eventually become rich off Delilah's waffle recipe, pancakes in the film. Despite the success this brings both of them, they both face problems with their daughters. Delilah's daughter Piola is born fair-skinned and tries to pass for white, eventually disowning her mother altogether.
Do I look like her daughter?
And the film was ahead of the game in casting Freddie Washington to play Piola. She herself was a light-skinned black actress. In fact, most of the tragic mulatto characters who popped up in the 40s and 50s were played by white actresses, including Susan Kohner, who played the role in the 1959 remake.
What's my baby want? I want to be white, like I look.
The 1934 version was a real trailblazer when it comes to the subject matter, but for ages it seemed like it would never get off the ground. The script wasn't officially approved until after they'd been shooting for 2 weeks, and the effects of the censorship are really felt. While it was very important in terms of representation at the time, the Delilah and Piola subplot feels very lacking. Films featuring minority characters at the time would often film them in such a way that they could be edited out when shown in conservative areas like the South. So it kind of makes sense that a film featuring prominent minority characters like Delilah and Piola wouldn't really know how to use them yet. So while the 1934 version was a good attempt, I'm not surprised that someone gave it a second try.
How do you explain to your child she was born to be hurt?
The remake was planned as a musical in early stages, with names like Pearl Bailey or Mahalia Jackson attached. Mahalia still manages a cameo towards the end.
Out sooner will be done.
You can see remnants of this in the colourful sets and costumes, Laura becoming a Broadway star and Sarah Jane wanting to become a dancer. But melodrama was Douglas Sirk's specialty, so...
They didn't ask me! Why should I tell them?
Because that's what you are, and it's nothing to be ashamed of.
He had never read the book or watched the first film, so plenty of changes were made. Bee becomes Laura, and instead of a businesswoman, she now becomes an actress who wants to become a Broadway star. Delilah is now Annie, and Piola is now Sarah Jane.
Why, there's Sarah Jane. There's my baby.
Now, the marketing focused heavily on Lana Turner, Sandra Dee, John Gavin, all the love triangle hijinks and fancy clothes, but the film itself was a different story.
Are you happy here, honey? Are you finding what you really want?
I'm somebody else. I'm white. White. White!
Douglas Sirk actually cut down a lot of the Laura Susie stuff and gave more screen time to Annie and Sarah Jane, viewing that as the real story of the film.
You don't know what it means to be different.
He made several other changes to Annie's character in order to reflect the ongoing civil rights movement. In the book and 1934 film, Delilah's recipe makes Bee rich, and she turns down an offer for 20% of the profits to still keep working as Bee's servant.
But if I sign them, then what? Then you'll have a 20% interest in the Aunt Delilah Corporation.
You'll be rich.
Laura's change in job from businesswoman to actress means that she becomes successful on her own merits. So Annie is in the servant role from the beginning, and she never gets that opportunity to become rich. On paper, it probably seems awful that the female lead of colour spends most of the movie as a servant, but the film uses Annie to really examine the mammy stereotype.
No, you ain't. You can't show your bosom for 3 o'clock.
Much like Susie Wong, Annie isn't servile because that's her place. It's established early on that she has trouble finding work because of Sarah Jane.
But people just won't take in a woman with a child. And no matter what, I won't be separated from my baby.
So Annie's options are limited, and she's extra nice to Laura because until she becomes a star, she's dependent on her kindness. And when she becomes famous, she stays with her because she's famous, so she pays well.
Any money? No, Miss Laura, thanks to you, I'm well fixed. I've plenty to send Sarah Jane to college.
The movie has a scene where Laura discovers that Annie has a whole social life she doesn't even know about.
I belong to the Baptist Church, and I belong to several lodges, too. I didn't know. Miss Laura, you never asked.
And the movie doesn't hesitate to point out the huge power imbalance between them. Susie calls Laura out for pretty much using Annie as a backup mother for her.
Let's face it, Mama. Annie's always been more like a real mother. You never had time for me.
In the context of the film, without Annie, the household would fall apart. And there's a scene where Sarah Jane makes fun of the mammy stereotype.
I learned it from my mammy, and she learned it from old Massa, for she belonged to you.
And it's presented as a real slap in the face to the work that Annie does to make sure she's provided for.
Sarah Jane, why did you do that? What's the matter with you?
With a little more freedom than the 1934 version, the remake shows a lot more of the racism that Annie and Sarah Jane have to face.
Here, Sir Jane, you can have Nancy.
I don't have any little colored girl in my class.
Say, listen, if you're the new maid, I want to report that my shower's full of ants.
And Annie is casually disrespected multiple times when she's out in public. There's even a moment where she's assumed to be Sarah Jane's mammy.
So, honey child, you had a mammy.
And of course... America was going through the civil rights movement at the time, and Sarah Jane represents someone caught right in the middle of that. She's still young enough to remember a childhood during segregation. Although society was slowly moving towards more opportunities for African Americans, Sarah Jane has grown up more privileged thanks to Laura's success. She's shown going to Laura's shows, getting nice clothes, and having a fancy room of her own. And in some ways, Laura's success has created a separation between Sarah Jane and her mother. Annie has to work as a maid and housekeeper, while Sarah Jane has kind of grown up as Susie's privileged sister. Before they met Laura and Susie, things were quite different for them.
I don't want to live in the back. Why do we always have to live in the back? Shh, honey.
So in some ways, Sarah Jane has associated being black with being poor, and being white with being rich. And the irony of this is that once she's completely abandoned her identity and started passing for white fully, she's shown living in a motel or working as a low-class dancer in seedy nightclubs. In some ways, Sarah Jane's story is not about trying to hide her heritage, but her poor roots. And in her last scene with Annie, you can see this illusion breaking.
Oh, my baby. My beautiful, beautiful baby.
Passing for white has not improved her life at all. She's been hiding all her life and doesn't know how to do anything else, even when it's actively hurting her. It's clear in her last scene with Annie that she doesn't really want this. She's just found herself in this world that she doesn't know how to escape from. And sadly, it takes Annie dying for her to realise her mistakes. The 1934 version ended this way too, and it's said that Piola will now attend the college that her mother wanted her to go to. This is a big departure from the book where she moved to Europe and never returned. I see Sarah Jane's story as a way of civil rights America reconciling the past. With integration of public schools, the Montgomery bus boycott, and the rise of Martin Luther King, the future now held more opportunities for African Americans than ever before. There would soon be a whole generation who wouldn't know what it was like to grow up during segregation. And it's ironic in this remake that rather than going down the academic route, Sarah Jane instead chooses to become an entertainer. Sarah Jane choosing to become an entertainer as she passes for white could be a nod to the plight of Freddie Washington, who played the role in the original.
Freddie Washington said that the character she felt didn't want to be white for the sake of whiteness. She wanted to be white to have the same chances that everybody else in that house.
Because she was open about her heritage, she had trouble getting good roles. This contrasts with actresses like Rita Hayworth or Merle Oberon, who kept their heritage hidden, and they enjoyed much more success. Performers who were open about their ancestry usually ended up in stereotypical roles. Hattie McDaniel pretty much played maids and mammy for most of her career. Anna May Wong was usually the dragon lady. Rita Moreno was usually the barefoot Latina in westerns. So with that context, it makes sense that Sarah Jane might not want to acknowledge her heritage. But I'll take you to a performer called Theodore Lincoln Monroe Andrew Perry, the first African American to become a millionaire. He did so by working as an entertainer in vaudeville, playing a character called Stepping Fetchit, the laziest man alive.
I ain't gonna open that door. Right here, lazy though. I can't get all my sleep.
He appears as a character in the play Fetch Clay, Make Man, where he's mocked by Muhammad Ali for playing such a stereotypical role, and he snaps back saying, "I snuck through the back door so you could go through the front." Hattie McDaniel was quoted as saying, "Why should I complain about making $700 a week playing a maid? If I didn't, I'd be making $7 a week being one." And she was the first African American to win the Oscar. And the Best Actress award didn't go to a woman of colour until 70 years later. Rita Moreno likewise won an Oscar for an arguably stereotypical part in West Side Story, but she still won the Oscar.
Good Lord! I leave you with that.
And although Anna May Wong was never officially recognised by Hollywood, she and Sesue Hayakawa still became the first Asian celebrities there. Sarah Jane, looking down on her mother for being a servant, is ignoring all the hard work she's done to give her a good life. Annie has worked hard to make sure she's provided for, and she's made a living in a world that wasn't kind to people of her race. The film is really telling the newer generation that, while their parents may have had less opportunities than them, they still worked hard to build a better future. In a similar vein, the 1934 film might not look like much these days, but Louise Beavers and Freddie Washington did get the ball rolling. Both the Imitation of Life versions and the original novel took bold steps in telling their stories. The 1934 film fought the Hays Code like hell to feature a biracial character at all, while the 1959 film really upped the stakes to tell a black woman's story in ways that it hadn't been told before. Even watching it back today, Imitation of Life still packs a really powerful punch.
Goodbye, honey. You take good care of yourself. Goodbye.